legislators and others around the state who can attend at this hour that they'd love to learn. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Logan Mitchell, atmospheric scientist at University of Utah, who is doing innovative work along the Wasatch Front and across the US to characterize atmospheric pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. Logan was born in Texas and grew up all over the United States, mainly in the West and Midwest. He got his PhD from Oregon State University, where he worked on greenhouse gases in ice cores. He has traveled to Antarctica several times, including to collect ice cores. So if you have any questions beyond local air pollution, feel free to bring those up. Dr. Mitchell's current research is at a really interesting intersection between advanced geospatial analysis and atmospheric chemistry. For example, he utilizes mobile platforms such as the TRAX trains in Salt Lake City, where they've installed air monitoring equipment, and then also Google Street View cars to measure atmospheric composition to improve our high resolution, both temporally and spatially, our high resolution understanding of these pollutants. He also is actively involved in translational science. So he works to bring this technical understanding to policymakers to support stakeholders and policymakers in making science-informed decisions. He is very enthusiastic personally about air quality and climate issues, a great person to talk with. He just was on TV this morning, so feel free to reach out to him after this talk. I'm going to turn the time over to you, Dr. Mitchell. You've got till 11:50.
All right, thanks, Ben, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining in. So I'm going to be talking about the history of air quality in Utah. And it turns out this is a fascinating topic that I didn't know much about until about a year ago when I started looking into this. So we all know that air quality is a big issue along the Wasatch Front. Here's a headline from the New York Times from a few years ago. Utah is seen as a nature lover's paradise, but it struggles with air quality. And in Utah, we have about 40 days a year where we are in violation of federal air quality standards. Generally, about half of those occur in the wintertime from particulate matter, and that's what we're most familiar with because we can see it. But actually, half of our air quality violations occur in the summertime as well, and that's with ozone, and you usually can't see it. It can be a bluebird day in the summer, and there's really high levels of ozone. And these air quality issues are caused by multiple factors. Obviously, emissions from combustion of fossil fuels is an important component. But also in northern Utah, we have our topography. The mountains create these basins, which are natural chambers that accumulate the emissions. And part of the reason why that happens is because of our meteorology. We have temperature inversions that create a physical barrier to the mixing, and that's what causes emissions to build up. And then you have atmospheric chemistry. There's actually chemistry that goes on. A lot of the particulate matter that we breathe in the wintertime doesn't actually get emitted as particulate matter, but it actually gets emitted as nitrogen oxides or VOCs, and then go through chemical reactions that form particulate matter. And so it's actually really, really complicated, and there's a lot of science that's still going on to this day, trying to understand how all of these factors contribute to really poor air quality in Utah. And the reason why we care about this is because we know that air quality is bad for our health. So this is a recent summary of all of the different health impacts of air quality, and it's really the point of this figure is to highlight how much of this health research is actually being conducted in Utah. So Utah-based health studies are highlighted in red there, and it kind of goes through all of the different health systems: your heart, your lungs, your brain, your bone, pancreas, health impacts in children, skin, and overall mortality. Air quality is really challenging because it affects all these different components of our body. And especially in recent years, air quality is a top public concern. So this is a 2014 survey from Envision Utah, and it showed air quality is one of the top 3 priorities in Utah. And then they also asked people to say, how is Utah performing on the priorities? And air quality ranked dead last. So it's a really big issue, and we're really not doing enough. And that has continued. This is a Utah Foundation survey from 2016 and a 2019 survey during the mayoral race in Salt Lake City. And air quality continues to rank in the top few concerns of Utahns. And it's because we know that there's this health and economic impact from this challenge. So kind of my motivating questions as I started to dig into this is, when did air quality register as a prominent public health concern? And what has been done to address it in the past? How did the scientific understanding of air quality evolve over time? And what was Utah's role in the national conversation around understanding air quality? And what's the future of air quality in Utah? And it turns out this is a massive topic that I had no idea about. So this is kind of a timeline of some of the major events, and you don't need to look at all of these things, but I just wanted to, we'll step through each of these individually. But I wanted to kind of give you the big picture, showing that there were things happening all the way back to the 1850s when the settlers first arrived in Utah. So going back to that time period, the first, kind of in the early settlement of Utah, energy use was dominated by wood burning and coal combustion. So this is a figure from the EIA showing energy usage by different fuels. And so biomass burning, this yellow gold line, that's wood burning. And that was really the primary fuel. And through the late 1800s, coal combustion started to ramp up. So as I started looking into this, one of the most interesting quotes that I found was actually from Brigham Young. So this is the Deseret News newspaper from September 26, 1860. And back then, the remarks from President Brigham Young were just printed in the paper. And so this is a long speech that he gave. And one of the quotes that I thought was really interesting is he said, "What constitutes health, wealth, joy, and peace? In the first place, good, pure air is the greatest sustainer of animal life." And the point he was making is that, you know, you can go without other things that are essential in life for a time, but air is essential every moment. And really his focus here was on indoor air quality, making sure that homes were well ventilated so that the smoke from your fire, from your cooking fire, goes outside the house and doesn't get stuck inside the house, especially in rooms where you sleep, because you spend a lot of time there. And it's fascinating because there's a lot of research now looking at indoor air quality today. And indoor air quality is a big issue in the developing world, where it causes a lot of mortality. Just like back then in the 1850s and 1860s. But even now, as we're getting improving our methods of measurement techniques and looking into this more, we're starting to see challenges with air pollution from gas stoves in homes. And because there's combustion happening in stoves from your stove, that's actually affecting the air quality in your home. And so there's a lot more research going on about that now. And so it's kind of interesting to see. Brigham Young was obviously a man before his time. And his what he said is still relevant today. But this awareness of air quality, really starts to grow in the 1880s. And this is an editorial from the Salt Lake Tribune Deseret Evening News in 1881. And I think this quote is really interesting because it says Salt Lake's beginning to suffer in some degree from the smoke nuisance. And the time is not far distant when some regulation will have to be adopted and enforced to abate it, to address this air pollution. They're recognizing that this is having impacts on the city. And it said, would not it be just as well for those whose businesses require use of coal in large quantities to find some remedy for excessive smoke of their own volition, and thus avoid declaring their works a public nuisance and having to impose regulations. We think so, and throw out the suggestion, which is really fascinating, because even back then in the 1880s, there's this preference for industry to address their emissions without the need for regulations. And that same mentality is exactly the same as today. And so one of these days we're going to get to it. But in the meantime, the air quality issues continued to get worse. And in 1891, Salt Lake City passed its first air quality ordinance. And here's the actual ordinance from the Salt Lake City Recorder's Office. Smoke emitted from chimneys, it's a misdemeanor to have a poorly operated boiler, and you can get fined $5 to, I think, $50 per day for air quality violations. And what's also interesting about this is that this is 5 years. This regulation was passed 5 years before Utah became a state. So that means that Utah has had air quality regulations on the books for the entire history of our state. And in those days, kind of the focus of this was on installing what they called smoke consumers. Back in the day, they didn't call it air pollution, they called it smoke, because that's what they could see being emitted from chimneys. And especially the focus was on efficient use of combustion. So when you have a well-burning fire, anyone who's been in the Boy Scouts or been out camping and built a fire, you know that if you have a fire that's burning at the right temperature, it doesn't produce very much smoke. But if it's burning at a really low temperature or it's really inefficient, it produces a lot of smoke. And so that was kind of the focus, is optimizing the efficiency of fuels. In 1893, there was a discussion about how meteorology and wind speeds affect air pollution emitted from factories. And this actually helped people decide where to put factories as the city was starting to develop. And what they decided was, one of the quotes in this story is, "Smoke never crosses a river." And this is kind of a basic understanding of meteorology. And so they decided that a lot of the factories that were built to service the growing Salt Lake City area should be built west of the Jordan River. And that's where today a lot of the refineries are located. And it's really interesting to me that, I mean, back in the day, there weren't big neighborhoods there, but over time, neighborhoods have built up around where those factories are, and it's created all of these environmental justice challenges. And it's interesting to note that those challenges today have their roots in urban development decisions that were made in the 1890s about air pollution and how air pollution is affected by meteorology. In the early 1900s, smelters became a really big industry in Utah because there was a lot of mining, and in Utah, was a important trade hub. There was a lot of smelting going on, and one of the challenges, though, was that emissions from the smelters that include lead, arsenic, sulfur dioxide, and a bunch of other stuff killed the crops that were adjacent to the smelters. And so this created this big conflict between smelters and farmers. And over time, the farmers, eventually the farmers banded together and actually sued the smelters for these impacts on their farms. And in 1907, there was a big case that went to federal court in the Eighth Circuit, and it's American Smelting and Refining versus Godfrey et al. And the farmers ended up winning that suit, and that kind of led to the early understanding of the legislation that would affect air pollution and emissions. And eventually this forced many of the smelters to leave the Salt Lake Valley and move to Tooele Valley or other places around the state. The smelters, for their part, accused the farmers of being bad at farming. And they accused farmers of what they called smoke farming, which is just suing the smelters instead of actually trying to farm. And this is a graphic from the Salt Lake Tribune or the Deseret News, kind of showing a farmer saying, "Say, Brother Joseph, do I have to farm my farm now?" And so this is kind of a political commentary of the time, kind of accusing the farmers of, not being actually good farmers and just trying to make a living off of lawsuits. The one interesting component of this was that smelters actually then funded research into agricultural practices to show and demonstrate that farmers weren't following best practices. And this led to advances in farming science that may have improved our national and global farming practices. And it was around the same time that the Haber-Bosch process was invented that revolutionized fertilizer production and led to the Green Revolution. And so it's kind of interesting to see how Utah's air quality issues ties into these other really important big national and global trends in scientific advancement that really benefited society. And I think today where we're at with clean energy is actually very reminiscent of this time period, where we can use our understanding of sound science and challenges with air pollution to really jumpstart our adoption of new technologies that could actually, in the end, really benefit society as a whole. In 1912, the Salt Lake Telegram published a 6-part investigative series on air quality, and it's actually really amazing to me. They cite millions of dollars going up in smoke because of the waste of fuel from inefficient combustion. They say that wasted fuel would build battleships if we could just use it more efficiently. And they recognized that the influence on health was really detrimental. They talked about, it's really fascinating to read these old stories because they talk about damage to outdoor markets. Back in the day, a lot of the markets were outside because it's more pleasant to be outside and there was better light. So food markets and furniture stores were outside getting, pollution was raining down on them. But it also damaged library books and laundry costs. These are kind of negative externalities, negative costs that are borne by the community from air pollution. And it's really surprising me because they basically had all the information they needed to really address and understand this problem back in 1912. But what they didn't have was access to alternative fuels. And so that's really what's changed about today. So in the early 1900s, energy was really dominated by coal. And in Utah, there was a really important research focus on trying to address this problem. And the metallurgical department at the University of Utah was created in 1914 and directed to coordinate with the U.S. National Bureau of Mines to investigate better grades of coal that produced lower emissions. They were trying to come up with a foolproof fuel that burned efficiently and didn't create air pollution. And so it's really cool to see research in Utah focusing on this. There's also was a lot of public engagement in this issue. Women's groups began organizing to address air quality issues. And they collected data on best practices from other cities to address air pollution. They made leaflets and passed them out across the city. And by this time, there are many ordinances passed in every city in Utah. And it's really interesting to see the kind of waging war on smoke kind of mentality, and really this engagement from all of these women's groups. And I think that's kind of an untold story that there's a lot more research that could be done on. In the 1920s, from 1919 to 1930, the first major national air quality study was actually conducted in Utah. Salt Lake City was chosen as an example city because it's a mid-sized city with a persistent air quality problem. And so this is the first fuel analysis, emission inventory that was created, looking at different sectors, looking at the residential sector, commercial, industrial, railroad. They actually set up air quality monitoring, and they did the first meteorological study, and looked at health and environmental impacts, and provided recommendations for ordinances and outreach on this issue. This was a massive study that lasted for many years. And just to give you a sense of what one of the tools they were using these things called Ringelmann charts, which can quantify the visual opacity of smoke emissions. So this is an example of the different degrees of smoke emissions. So there's a stack over there, and this is in Utah. I don't know which building it is, but it's in Salt Lake City. And when it's clean burning, you can't see any smoke coming out of it. But then as the efficiency degrades, you can see different, they call them density of smoke. And what they do is they take one of these charts and just hold it up to the sky right next to the smoke plume and say, oh, that's a number 5 smoke, or that's a number 3 smoke. And it's just based on the visual opacity. And we have regulations that are on the books to today that are based on visual opacity. If you ever hear about trucks that are emitting smoke from their tailpipe, you can actually report those if you see them on the highway, and there's websites for every county to do that in Utah and across the country. But those reports are based on visual opacity. It's this notion that if you can see smoke coming out of a vehicle, that's emissions that are creating poor air quality. And so it's interesting to see how these tools that were developed in the early 1920s are still being used today in some form. One of the components of this study, which is really interesting to me, was they did the first aircraft study of air pollution. One of the ideas at the time was that smelters were emitting sulfur dioxide, and since sulfur dioxide is denser than air, it was creating this kind of heavy blanket which prevents smoke from rising and mixing out. And at this time, they didn't know about inversions. They didn't know that was a thing. That was what was causing the accumulation of emissions. They thought it was the sulfur dioxide. And the scientists at the day, it's actually funny reading these old stories, because the scientists say, the air is well mixed. It can't be sulfur dioxide, but there's a lot of public concern about this, so we're going to investigate it. So they got in a biplane, and they evacuated these flasks you see in the picture on the right, creating a vacuum chamber, and then they got in their biplane and flew up through the inversion layer and opened up the flasks at different altitudes, and then took them back to the lab and measured the sulfur dioxide, and showed that no, indeed, it was not the sulfur dioxide that was causing that layer that's preventing the atmosphere from mixing. But it's really interesting, because this attitude, or this understanding of kind of blaming our air pollution on industry, is similar to the public's understanding of air pollution today. you ask people on the street today in Utah, what's causing our air pollution, many people will say, oh, it's the factories, it's Kennecott, or it's the refineries. And the reality is that those big industries only contribute roundabouts 10% of the air pollution that we have today. And most of the pollution is coming from vehicles today. Well, at the time, back then, it was mostly from coal combustion in homes, and it wasn't necessarily just the refineries. And so it's interesting, again, to see these parallels between over 100 years ago and today. In the Great Depression, air pollution became more of an interest, and in the New Deal, there was air quality monitoring was a component of job creation in the New Deal, almost like is being discussed today, where air pollution understanding is in science is a component of our some of the economic stimulus that's happening today. In the 1940s, the conditions continued to get worse, and in 1941 there was a concerted effort to pass more ordinances. And this is the front page of the Salt Lake Telegram. The Telegram is the same as the Salt Lake Tribune. It was called the Telegram before. This is March 1st, 1941. And the front page, Nazis take over Bulgaria. And so this is, obviously this is the start of World War II. But it's interesting, on the front page, with all of this global international news, here's news about local air quality. And this is, they're talking, they made charts, they made a graph of the smoke density. They're using the Ringelmann charts. They looked at smoke density in Salt Lake City for the last decade, and they're showing that the Salt Lake City continued to have an air quality issue. And they actually published, for a couple of months, they published Today's Smoke, which you can see on the left there. And it talked about the air quality conditions for the day. And it's very similar to the air quality index that you see in the newspapers today. This, I pulled the one on the right from the Salt Lake Tribune a couple of months ago. During World War II, there was a massive mobilization to, because of the war effort, we needed to produce a lot of steel and stuff for the war. And so that led to this dramatic increase in air pollution. This chart on the right is showing the number of hours of visibility of 3 miles or less due to smoke. And so these are measurements that started at the airport, kind of looking back at Salt Lake City, and when there's a lot of air pollution, you can't see very far. And so you can see this big bump in air pollution during the war effort. But then it started to improve a little bit afterwards. And in the 1950s, one big advancement in the scientific understanding of air pollution was the launching of radiosound balloons from the Salt Lake City airport. And so you can see the picture of what one of those balloons looked like, and they measure temperature as the balloon, rises through the atmosphere. And you can get these profiles that can show you what an inversion actually is. And this scientific understanding was coupled, or these measurements were coupled with ground-based measurements, and it really led to this renaissance of understanding about what inversions really were. And it was the beginning of the understanding of the thermal component of air pollution challenges. And this was at the same time that inversions were causing other major air pollution episodes in other parts of the world. The London fog event, which caused thousands and thousands of deaths, happened around this time. And the Denora air pollution event in Pennsylvania, both of these were caused by inversions as well, and create a lot of public attention. And in the science that was being developed in Utah was actually explaining why that actually happened. In 1962, the governor and the Utah legislature commissioned the first major state-led effort to understanding the air resources of Utah, air quality impacts in Utah. And this is actually a really fantastic document. And I only learned about it as I was doing this deep dive into our air quality history. They summarized the research that had been done to date. And they ultimately concluded that some of the concern was driven by monitoring related to nuclear fallout. They ultimately concluded that they needed more measurements, more data to really understand the challenges and what they could do. And they decided to collect more data before kind of taking state level action. In the 1960s, kind of the focus of air pollution shifted from states to a more national focus because air quality issues across the country were getting worse and worse. And so the Clean Air Act in 1963 was passed. And this was kind of to help us understand the problem, but there were no regulations. In 1965, the Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Control Act was passed. This was the first regulations of automobiles at the federal level and started to improve combustion from cars. And you can actually see the shift in energy usage in the United States. Coal combustion was decreasing for home heating, but it was moving outside the cities to rural areas for electricity production. And in cities, the energy usage was primarily coming from cars. And so that's again reflected in Utah. Here's the Bountiful mayor writing a editorial about the benefits of electric cars. And this first paragraph is really fascinating to me because, and again, this is 1963, and he says, the electric automobile for clean, quiet, efficient urban transportation is the subject of sharply increased interest these days as a means of combating air pollution, noise, and traffic congestion. And it's just fascinating to me that this article was about the Electro-Air, which there's a picture of what it looked like. GM was developing it in 1966. That's the model in 1966. And it was going to have a range of 100 miles and the top speed of 80 miles an hour. It's going to be equivalent to today's Nissan Leaf. But unfortunately, GM stopped development of that car, and instead, continued to develop the cars that they did that were reliant on fossil fuels. And it's interesting today, recently GM in the last couple of months announced that they were going to convert to all electric cars by 2035. And so it took a while for GM to get around to it, but they're eventually gonna make it. The Clean Air Act amendments were passed in 1970 that created the EPA. And that really triggered a renaissance in trying to understand the measurements and improve our scientific understanding of air pollution. And they were trying to understand the impacts of particulates. And in 1981, they were testing new instruments. And these are the first PM 2.5 measurements in Utah, were from 1981. And it showed that even back then, we had inversions that were creating pretty bad air quality conditions. And at the time, they didn't understand the health impacts of PM 2.5, but these were the first measurements that later went on to help us understand the health impacts. In the mid 80s, there's a really fantastic case study. This is there was a labor dispute that closed the Geneva Steel plant for 1 year, and you can see the headline. Oh, actually, I've got it on next. I've got one more slide that has. Here's the full page headline from the Daily Herald, and you can see the Geneva Steel belches back to life with a plume of smoke. And this is September 13th, 1987. And Dr. Arden Pope, who's at BYU, this kind of study launched his career studying air pollution. And now he's written some of the most cited research on air pollution in the field of air pollution research. And so he's quite famous, and he's kind of one of your crown jewels that we're always a little bit jealous of, but he's a wonderful collaborator as well. In 1990, the governor of Utah commissioned a clean air commission to look at the challenge of air quality and come up with some recommendations. And they made 146 legislative and budget recommendations to address air quality, very analogous to what happens now every year in our legislature. And at the time, it kind of set the policy direction for the following decades. But what was really striking is that they really identified three options. Utah had three options for its future in 1990. Option one was to allow air pollution to increase. Option two was to meet the federal minimum air quality standards. Or option three was to really tackle the problem and reduce air pollution levels significantly below federal standards. And they determined that number one was illegal, of course, because there are now federal air quality standards, so that wasn't an option. But also option three, the technology wasn't available to pursue that option economically. And so there was a big long discussion about what kind of technologies they'd really need to really reduce air pollution levels significantly below federal standards. And what's fascinating to me is that today, 30 years later, we're finally able to pursue option three, if we decide to, if our political and business and social leaders decide that that's the direction that we want to go in. And really, this is kind of where I want to end here. And this is Governor Cox's One Utah Roadmap. This is his page that I just pulled out of it on economic advancement. And what I really want to highlight here, I don't have to look through all of these things, but throughout Utah's economic advancement, there's a key component of sustainable growth embedded into our future. And it's this recognition that our economic future in Utah really depends on addressing these challenges, but also there will be economic opportunities as we grow and invent new technologies to produce clean energy. So this creates immense opportunities for Utah to finally solve its air quality issues for the first time in 170 plus years. And what will be interesting is Utah really has this opportunity to lead, show how the conservative state can address these issues and build on bipartisan solutions that can really be implemented around the world. And here's a quote from Speaker Brad Wilson, I think from last year, talking about how air quality really cuts across partisan lines, and it's just a really important issue in our state. And there's a lot of common ground that we can have. So with that, I think I see there's some chat messages in the chat, and I can start looking at those. But if there are any other questions, I'd love to hear your questions and any thoughts that you all have.
Thank you so much, Logan, for that really interesting overview. Feel free, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask it, or type it into the chat.
Logan, I want to ask, first of all, thank you so much. This is really fascinating. And I want to ask about your research methods, because so much of your information, you can't just Google this stuff. I mean, and I think I've kind of lost my mindset of how do you get information in other ways. So can you just comment about how you obtained all this information?
Yeah, so I actually think that this wouldn't have been possible even just a few years ago. I started down this path because I was just trying to figure out, a year ago when I started looking into this, I only knew about things from kind of the 1980s onwards. And then the Utah Digital Newspaper Archive, which has been going back and digitizing newspapers all the way back to the 1850s, has been a fantastic resource. And they're still in the process of digitizing papers. They are constantly getting small grants, and they'll digitize, a decade of Deseret newspapers. And when they digitize it, they scan it. They also run character recognition, so you can search for keywords. And so initially I was looking at, I was just searching for air quality, and stories about air quality go back to the 1950s or so. And so I thought, oh, okay, this was an issue back to the 1950s. But then I realized, wait a second, before then, they didn't talk about air quality. That wasn't a term that they used. They used smoke. And so then over time, I figured out the right terms to search for. And then it opened up this whole area of information that I just didn't even know existed. So it's been a little bit of kind of just poking around old newspapers. And then through that, I was able to find articles about research projects that were going on, like the studies in the 1920s and the smelters. And that led then to refine my search of legal cases and government reports that exist that covered those topics. So it's been a really interesting process. And I also say that there's a lot more to do. I'm currently trying to write this up into a paper, but there are so many more avenues to investigate. An example of that is that Native Americans have a really interesting history with air quality, because before the settlers arrived, there's a lot of wood combustion, and there's some accounts of, maybe they're noticing that smoke hung in Utah valleys more than other places, and those air quality challenges exist through today, because out in the Uinta Basin, obviously there's a lot of oil and gas production on tribal lands, and that is leading to challenges with ozone in those areas as well. And so there's just a really interesting relationship with air quality, and that's true of all of these different topics. There's so much more to find out about it. And I think it's really interesting because it provides context for us to understand our current challenges today. Understanding our history helps us understand our present and our future.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating.
I just got a question that came to me personally instead of to everyone, but it says, given where we are economically and technologically, what would be the most effective individual and communal actions to accelerate the decrease of air pollution?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things to recognize is that a lot of these challenges are systemic. When you turn on your lights in your home, you don't get to choose if your energy comes from coal combustion or natural gas or a solar panel. You just turn on your lights and you expect it to work. And a lot of it's also important to acknowledge that our history was enabled. Our society has been enabled by fossil fuels, but that going forward, we're in this transition period, and the challenge is going to be solved systemically. And so the most important thing you can do is to recognize that, recognize it's a big issue, and so that's why you need to talk to your legislators and your folks in your community and business leaders in your university. All of those folks can, affect and drive investment decisions and infrastructure decisions that will ultimately affect all of us. And so joining an effective group that lobbies effectively, understanding your role within that group, because any one of us can't do everything. And so understanding, maybe you bake food and you can help facilitate gatherings when COVID is over and we can get together again. And that's your contribution to a group discussion. Understanding your role, or maybe you're really good at talking to legislators and that's your role, or maybe you do research and that's your role. Understanding how you fit into the larger picture and then doing that is really important. And obviously there are personal decisions that can affect the outcome as well. Installing a heat pump when you're ready to upgrade your appliances in your home, installing heat pumps, or when you're ready to upgrade your car or get a new car, look at electric vehicles, see what's available, and see if that works for you, for your budget and for your usage. And every year there's going to be more and more electric cars available, and at the end of the year there's going to be several electric trucks available. And so the folks that can afford that, it'd be really great to see some adoption. It'd be really great for our state to really incentivize that, the adoption of clean energy technologies, because it's a virtuous cycle. Because if you are getting more people adopting new technologies, then all of a sudden it creates challenges that we need to invent solutions for, and then those solutions then become a new market that we can sell in other areas of the country and around the world. And so there's this great virtuous cycle.
Thank you. Building on that, a personal question for me, with your interactions with state legislators and regulators, what's your frank assessment of how seriously they take this issue? And what are some of the current roadblocks, to mix a metaphor, I guess, to making progress on this issue? I love the positive spin that you're giving, but why aren't we making faster progress?
It's a really good question. I think there's a lot of unfortunate history of politicization of energy that's happened over the last few decades, and really progress in addressing this issue has kind of been caught in the crossfire. And so we're quite frankly behind. We're behind other states, and we're behind the rest of the world. And so that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, because in some ways, the technology has been advancing so fast that we can leapfrog some of the steps that other places have taken, and to go straight to the front of the line and developing new technologies. And it's up to our political leaders and all of us to push them to really have that vision and to go in that direction, and aligning government incentives with the innovation capacity of the free market and of all of our business leaders. Utah has amazing tech resources, and we just need to leverage that with the proper incentives, and really amazing things are possible. And so I really appreciate Governor Cox's approach to this issue. He doesn't seem like he's trying to make it a big partisan issue. He's just like, let's get it done. And I really appreciate that. And I hope that with enough focus and enough interest, that we'll be able to really launch forward and really make some big strides in the coming decade.
Thank you so much. I see one final question from Isabella Arrigo, actually a graduate student here and one of your collaborators. Isabella, did you want to make your question comment?
Oh, hi, Logan. Yes. Okay. I guess my question is kind of, sorry, I'm on the train right now. My next question is kind of piggybacks off of Ben's question. But you talk about how at the beginning, how like there's this huge people in Utah care about air pollution, and people in Utah, they like see that it's an issue, but then most of air pollution is coming from vehicles and from just the general public. And so how do you bridge that divide? So we already talked about bridging this divide between legislators, but then how do you see, like, what would you say would be most effective approaches to bridging the divide between the general public and getting them to understand that it's their personal actions that will make a big impact on our air pollution?
Yeah, I think there's two components of that. One is the systemic nature of it. Right now, if you go down to Home Depot and ask, if you need to replace your water heater, what does the person at Home Depot recommend? Or if you're talking to your electrician, or your plumber, or somebody who's installing HVAC, what are they recommending? And what's the cheapest option right now? Are there economic incentives that can be used to make the clean energy the cheapest solution? That's actually the easiest solution. And I think there will be a tipping point where it just becomes, oh, you need to upgrade your furnace. Well, clearly you need a heat pump. There's an opportunity also to upgrade our building codes so that new houses are installed from the get-go with, they're wired so that you can charge an electric vehicle. And they're also ready to be set up so that you don't need natural gas in the home. And making those decisions now will really save us a lot of money in the long term, because if a home is built now with natural gas, in 20 years or so, somebody's going to have to pay to pull that natural gas out to install all electric, because that's where things are going. We're at a really interesting time right now where the folks that understand the scale of the problem with air pollution and with the changing climate, you can see where things are going. We are going towards clean energy. It's going to happen. It's a matter of when, not if. And so thought leaders on this really, they see that happening and they say, let's cut to the front of the line and be part of that solution and be part of that economic growth. And rather than waiting and kind of being at the tail end of that transition and really having to buy that technology from other people that's invented in China or Germany or California, let's have those innovations and that job creation occur in Utah. That would be much better for us. And we can see that's where things are going. And there's no question about where things are going. And we have the opportunity to lead on that, or if we don't, then someone else will.
Dr. Mitchell, on behalf of PWS and BYU, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Really wish you the best. Most people have to sign off. Thank you. Thanks all who attended.
Thanks for having me.
Really great seminar. Really appreciate you being with us. Thanks.
Thanks, Logan.
Yeah, and extra points to Isabella for fielding a question about air quality on the train. That really was fabulous, Logan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. I was happy to do it.
Are you I'm just curious if you're thinking of putting a book together. Seems like a book. I mean.
Yeah. So I think that there is content enough for a book, and I think there would be a lot of interest in a book, but I have never written a book. And that seems like a very daunting challenge to me to write a book.
And it's not like you don't have anything else going on. So. Right,
exactly. So if somebody wanted to write a book and was interested in a partnership, I would love to partner on a book. But it's just a matter of finding that right person.
Yeah. Well, it really is. It reminds me of some great, popular science books where they just do that rare, really deep dig like you've done here. And so I'm not volunteering, But if I find that right person for you, I'll send them along, because
Yeah, definitely.
it really is a massive amount of information and fascinating. And I agree with you that it helps us think about our current situation differently. So.
Yeah.
Again, maybe this is too specific for a BYU audience, but your original Brigham Young quote about the importance of pure air reminded me of a talk that not Josh Groberg, that's the singer. I think it's Elder Groberg, I can't remember the first name. He's a prominent church general authority in the LDS church. And he gave a devotional here at BYU where he called on BYU to become the pollution control center of the world, that we should, with our values and focus on science and society, that we should be leading out on that. I'll send you the link to it. Again, it may not be of interest to a broader audience, but for us.
Well, I think it's important to Utah. Like this, this history is relevant to Utahns, and so I think that's very highly relevant, and it's fascinating. That's something I would, looking at the church's involvement and the value systems that relate to air quality through time, I think would also be a fascinating component to this. Like if there was a book, that would be a full chapter of the book.
For sure.
Because there's really important scholarship and messaging about that. I think is really helps to flesh out Utah's relationship with air quality.
That would be really cool.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of really gifted people in humanities that I can put you in contact with, who I think would be really interesting on collaborating on a kind of book level project.
Yeah, I would love that. I actually just gave a talk to the incoming grad students in the University of Utah Humanities Department, kind of with that same idea. But if the humanities department, if there's a group of students who might be interested, or faculty who would be interested, I would be more than happy to give this similar presentation to them.
Okay.
And with that intention of, here's some opportunities. There's a lot of research that's still yet to be done. And there's really important stories to be told about an issue that's of prominent importance to Utahns. So I think would be highly relevant. I would love to get, I am not a historian. I am very self-aware of the fact that I'm doing a lot of social science research, and I do not have the traditional tools and training to really, provide the context. And there's, the question about what was Utah's role in the development of the agricultural revolution in the 19 teens and 20s, I think is a really fascinating component that I don't know anything about that green revolution. And I would love to have a partner who's actually studied that. Yeah. Who knows more of the context and could place what happened in Utah in the broader context. It'd be really fascinating.
I was just enthralled when you so the farmers sue the smelters, and then the smelters do research to disprove the farmers, and then it ends up pushing things forward.
And then it leads to innovation in farming technology that benefits all of humanity. Yeah. It's really fascinating. But it also points to some, the whole merchants of doubt, with industries that are trying to spread misinformation. This is kind of like the early prototype of that, where they were doing legitimate science. It wasn't focused on creating doubt. They were like, hey, let's do research to see if we can understand why, this is happening, or, research to show that the farmers aren't doing the right thing. Yeah. So it's interesting. That's also another